Okay, so it is my great pleasure to introduce Margarita Tadevosyan. Margarita comes to us with first a bachelor's in sociology from Yerevan State University, then a master's in conflict resolution from Yerevan State University, then a master's from George Mason University in peace operations policy, and then finally she is here in our PhD program. Looking forward to your presentation.
Thank you. Thank you everyone for being here, and I want to thank my committee and Dr. Susan Allen in particular for shepherding this for this many years, and I'm very glad to be here finally. So my dissertation talks about the multidimensional roles of local non-governmental organizations in the South Caucasus in creating reconciliation spaces. How I came interested in this topic is through my practical engagement in the region, where I was working with local organizations on some peace processes, and I noticed that there are three main issues with the current paradigm as we think about peace building and reconciliation processes and the involvement of non-governmental organizations. The first issue was how we think about and talk about non-governmental organizations. A lot of times different terms are used to describe these organizations, which create a lot of confusion because each of them have their own merit. However, zooming into and understanding what are NGOs in this work is an important component of understanding the work. Also, a lot of times literature talks about local NGOs putting together large international organizations together with a smaller local organization, which does not do due justice to smaller organizations. It doesn't really highlight the impact and the work that they're able to do in their own communities. Second of all, we are used to think about reconciliation as a process, which is a linear process that has beginning and the end, but at the same time it's a mutual process where two sides come together, working together to create, reconcile and create better future. I push off from a premise that thinking about reconciliation as a space rather than a process can help and provide us helpful insights in understanding post-conflict work, especially in restrictive environments where a lot of times travel and mutuality of the processes are not possible. And finally, thinking about how the social hierarchy is constructed within each society. We all know and probably familiar with the diagram presented by John Paul Lederach, where he outlines the social structure and talks about approaches to peace building as they are relevant to each of the structures. Being in the field, I've noticed that the dynamics are not that linear in the field, and once you introduce an international donor community as a powerful actor within this field, there are some changes and shifts that happen within the social hierarchy, and in my opinion that this and the research tries to show that a three-dimensional view of the social hierarchy can be a little more beneficial in our understanding of the power dynamics in the post-conflict settings. So pushing off from that background, I have identified that majority of the literature looks at the reconciliation as a process that addresses the power imbalances between conflicting parties and brings perpetrator and victims together for a process where they can work through their issues. At the same time, we are used to looking at psychological transformations and changes within personal identities as a key or tool for the reconciliation. I believe that the personal and this process-oriented and the bilateral view of reconciliation leaves out or neglects the habitat and the environment where these processes happen, and in the complex relationships that entities working towards reconciliation form with each other, upwards and downwards, to enable a certain environment where reconciliation process can take place. It also does not take into account the role of international actors. Everywhere in the world, almost exclusively, this type of work is funded by international organizations who have certain priorities, who have changing priorities, and this affects the type of work the organizations do in the region. So with all of that, the natural habitat of the NGOs that reflects a non-linear social hierarchy that enables these organizations to do their activities, to my knowledge, prior to this research, have not been studied, in particularly in the South Caucasus. So the purpose of this study was to explore the nested approach to reconciliation, where reconciliation processes are being embedded into reconciliation spaces, with a particular attention to the positioning of local NGOs in their own societies and how that positioning helps, enables or prevents them to maintain, manage and create reconciliation spaces. So this particular research pushed off this research question, which is, in the South Caucasus today, how does the positioning of local non-governmental organizations in their local societies affect their ability to create, manage and maintain reconciliation spaces? The research question had three distinct focus areas. First of all, it attempted to understand how peace building and reconciliation work is being conceptualized by the organizations who are carrying those out. Also to understand what is the position of organizations in their societies and how they develop upward and downward relationships and across with each other, and also the ways that the reconciliation spaces are being created. Why I thought that this study was important and how we can benefit from it, I hope that this study will help us to improve and develop knowledge and understanding of the work in post-conflict settings, as well as help us, the research practitioners, develop better engagement practices in the conflict-affected regions. For the donor community, I'm hoping that this will help to understand how their own practices affect this type of work, and also how to more effectively assess and think about reconciliation work in post-conflict settings. As well as for the local non-governmental organizations, I'm hoping that the takeaway lesson or key insights from this research will help them develop more effective communication mechanisms, not only with each other, but also with their constituencies and with their own governments. The literature that I reviewed to kind of frame my the foundation of this research touched on several key areas, including literature on non-governmental organizations, as well as I paid particular attention what does it mean to be an NGO that is engaged in the conflict resolution and peace building work, and how that work relates to larger peace processes and how it reinforces or does not fit into that pattern. Also, I looked at the NGOs that are at the social structure and how NGOs fit into the social structure, what type of power relations exist, and how the marginalization and empowerment of this organization work. And since South Caucasus is part of former Soviet Union, I did there was very limited literature on this, but I was able to identify some literature that talks specifically about NGOs in the post-Soviet spaces and post-communist spaces, and I'm hoping that this research will also add to the missing part of literature on non-governmental organizations in post-conflict and post-Soviet spaces. To carry out the tasks of the research, I embarked on an exploratory and descriptive research that was based on interpretivist qualitative approach, and I chose in particular a case study methodology, and I want to emphasize that this was a case study of the South Caucasus region and not the entities separately. And all the conclusions and the analysis had a regional focus and was looking at overarching themes throughout the entire region. I collected the data through in-depth, open-ended and semi-structured interviews during the summer of 2015. I was able to travel to Georgia and do interviews in Tbilisi, Gori and Ergeneti, as well as in Armenia. I did interviews with representatives of NGOs in Yerevan and Vanadzor and Stepanakert in Nagorno-Karabakh. Interviews with representatives of Abkhaz and South Ossetian representatives took place in London and Istanbul, and also I did interviews through Skype with the representatives of Azerbaijani NGOs. Altogether, I was able to do 45 interviews with 40 different organizations, as well as 7 interviews with representatives of 5 international donor organizations. The data analysis started with the transcription and translation of all interviews into English. I used contextual analysis and coded the information based on the large segment of the meaning and looked for recurring themes and patterns. And again, the regional focus was applied. I paid particular attention to be able to critically reflect on the fact what I want the data to tell me, but what is actually data is telling me, and to mitigate for the bias and to increase the validity quality of the data, 10% of the interviews were transcribed and translated second time months later, and the original transcripts were compared to the second transcript in order to make sure that I'm not using the words that I want to come out, but actually there was the words that were used by the respondents. Obviously, the research had some limitations, one of which was the physical access to the region, and I was able to find ways around it. However, I believe it would have been much beneficial if I had an access to all the regions and could have done the interviews there. Interestingly enough, there was very persistent lack of interest on the part of NGOs to participate in the research. Very often my emails and inquiries remain unanswered or ignored. Other cases where I was promised that they will contact, and even with the follow-up requests, I never received any answer from the NGOs. To compare and contrast to that, donor community was openly reluctant and refused to participate in this research. Only 5 of the 17 organizations that I reached out provided consent to participate in this research. So that was also very interesting, that donors did not want to talk about their practices of engagement with local organizations. Why South Caucasus? Obviously, it's my home. This is where I do also my practical work. But also, South Caucasus is the region with the longest lasting conflicts in the post-Soviet space that have ongoing escalations that cost human life. There is extensive international community engagement, both on a political level, but as well on the level of humanitarian assistance and assistance to the NGOs. And also, it represents an interesting combination of recognized, partly recognized and non-recognized states that yield some interesting results when we're looking at how NGOs are working in this type of environment. Moving to the findings and what are the key highlights of this research, I wanted to start off by talking a little bit about the history and how these organizations actually came about and what is the background of these organizations. So it can be, there can be identified 2 kind of waves of NGO development. The first one was right after the dissolution of the Soviet Union and with the active phases of the conflict in early 1990s. However, the later stage was in recent years, with the increased donor funding, kind of gave an impetus to the establishment for many organizations. This finding is very important and significant to the extent that the impact it has on the perception of the work that NGOs do in the region, and how public views, how the public view of the second generation of NGOs actually impacts the work of those more established NGOs of the first generation. As we can see from the quote from one of the Tbilisi-based NGO representatives, there is the sense that a lot of NGOs have emerged in the response of donor funding, that nobody knows what they're really doing, and they are there to, and they feed into the public perception that they are there to serve their own interests rather than address any particular need that the certain communities have. With that, there is pretty vibrant and extensive NGO sector in the region. In all the studied entities, the process of NGO registration has been deregulated, and it's very easy to register an organization, and there are many of them available. However, there is no necessarily a quality control mechanism, in a way that these organizations do not have a purposeful thinking behind them in terms of what type of issue or what type of social need that they're trying to address, rather than just it's an organization for a particular project that has been established. This, in its turn, leads to another issue of sustainability of local organizations. Many of the organizations still continue to operate from one funding cycle to another, and do not have any means of sustaining themselves through if there is gaps within the funding. Also, unlike in the West, for many almost everybody that I had an opportunity to talk to, NGO work was a part-time job in addition to their primary work for wages, and this resulted in a lack of strong primary NGO identity, which continued to emphasized the role of single person within the organization and had a negative impact on the sustainability of the organizations. Only very few organizations were able to develop or translate their personal capital into an organizational capital where the organization would continue its existence if the former leader or the founder of organization would depart the organization. And we can see from the quote provided by another a representative of Tbilisi-based organization that it's a prevalent issue in the region, not only in Georgia but also in the region, when if organization stops to exist after the person is taking up another job or leaves the country or passes away. With this background in mind, I would like to move to the describing what is the positioning of local organizations in their own society. And this is on the right, a modification of the pyramid that we saw in the beginning. And as we can see that there are significant and uneven gaps between different layers of the society. There is also a fragmentation of the NGO sector, and which is also important, a major disconnect between the public and the NGO sector in general. Talking about the dyadic relationship among all these layers, I would like to start with the intra-NGO sector dynamics and talk a little bit about how these relations work within the NGO sector. Obviously, everybody spoke about the necessity and the need of the cooperation among in order to enhance and boost the activities that they are doing. However, it was very interesting to find out what actually cooperation meant for the people in the region. And the most important way of how they see the cooperation was lending the expertise, which meant if one organization had, for example, a member that is an expert on a gender training and another organization is doing a project that requires a gender training, hiring this representative to work with them or including them in the new grant application is their understanding of cooperation rather than developing joint programs and together. So this was a very interesting conceptualization of what cooperation meant for them. It has to be mentioned that international organizations play a big role in kind of inducing cooperation in the region, and a lot of NGOs spoke about cooperating or coming together or even learning about each other's works in the framework of the projects of other organizations. And this was important because those joint initiatives were not at the initiative of local organizations, but were actually brought together by an outside player. And finally, there has been and there is some very limited information sharing and coordination among the local organizations. However, not at the extent that it should be or it could be for the benefit of the field. Non-cooperation, on the other hand, was more prevalent in the region, and one of the forms of non-cooperation was working in their own area of expertise. And I did purposefully include this under the non-cooperation because NGOs were very adamant and very careful to protect the boundaries of their expertise area and were not welcoming of other organizations to step in or other organizations with similar expertise to step in within that area. So that was the primary reason that I felt that this type of safeguarding of the space fits under the non-cooperation rather than cooperation. In particular, in the non-recognized or semi-recognized states, or people spoke about lack of appropriate level of organizations or number of organizations that they can work with. Also, given the sensitive nature of the work they do, people believe that they had to be able to trust others enough in order to be able to work with them. So lack of trust was another issue that was brought up a lot of times, and also market rules and competition for the for limited amount of grants that were allocated for the region. There are organizations who spoke about expressed tension with each other that was based a lot of times on the personalities, but also on the approaches adopted by certain organizations. This picture would not be complete if we assigned the entire blame of non-cooperation to the local organizations and their activities. The research helped to identify that a lot of this is actually donor instigated, and donor practices push the local organizations to be more hostile to each other rather than cooperative. Donors emphasize that when making a funding decision, they're looking at the credibility and the previous experience of the organizations, and this credibility is the competitive edge that many organizations do not want to share with each other. At the same time, donors emphasize that every time they look at the application, they're looking for new and innovative ideas, and NGOs spoke about not wanting to share information or some type of idea that others can take credit for. So that what it leads to having bubbles of organizations kind of floating in this space where they never really merge into something bigger that would have a bigger impact or would help the sector to develop as a whole. Moving to the second dyadic relationship is the relationship upwards with the government, and this is the view of the government NGO relations as it was presented by the local organizations. It does not incorporate the views of the government. So NGOs believe that the government has pretty negative view of them and thinks of them as a fifth column or the enemy from within. At the same time, in order to showcase to the public and international community their commitment to democratic development and the standards, they still allow some type of NGO activity, even though it is very much controlled. NGOs within this kind of with this background, they still choose to engage with the government as much as they can, and one of the most frequently used strategies is this persistent communication when they send out information or invite government officials to their events and meetings, even though usually those invitations remain unanswered. At the same time, NGOs believe that the reserved engagement is another approach that can yield better results, where they try to engage with the government on non-controversial issues that would yield less resistance on the side of the government, and they're trying to keep themselves as much separate as possible. And occasionally, obviously, there is an active confrontation with the government agencies. Some of the NGOs stress that they have active court cases against certain government agencies for human rights violations and so on. So this is the pattern that exists, and I based on the data, I decided to kind of describe this relationship as negatively asymmetrical. It is negative in the sense that neither NGOs have a big trust in the government and NGOs, and the government does not also trust the NGOs. But it's asymmetrical because if NGOs try to inch upward and somehow get a seat at the table and try to influence decision making, regardless of the constraints that they're facing, government rarely does any attempt to reach down and engage with the non-governmental organizations. This moves us to a third kind of dyadic relationship, which is the relationship between NGOs and the public. And here is where the most disappointing picture was present, because the largest gap exists between the society and the NGOs. The NGOs try to explain this by saying that a lot of times they are trying to raise issues that public is not ready to talk about because it touches the issues of patriotism, national identity, and a lot of questionable incidents can come up, which is why people don't want to air their dirty laundry. But at the same time, the local population does not trust the NGOs very much. They are seen as foreign agents that are funded by the West to carry out certain agenda. However, within this paradigm, it is important to note that there is some type of blame and responsibility that the local organizations have to take on themselves. And the quote by Yerevan-based NGO representative actually sums up that pretty accurately. According to this person, he says, "We are accountable to the donors and not our public. We do not tell our people what we have accomplished and what we have done. Lack of information, not knowing something is the first step towards mistrust." And this the lack of information that exists within these two layers is filled with the government propaganda against the NGOs, and public is pretty much susceptible to that information that comes from the authorities. At the same time, and since we're talking in particular about the organizations that are engaged in peace building and reconciliation, there is also a lack of social demand. In the periods, the region has been described of the periods of relative calm and peaceful time with occasional escalations of violence. So during the time of peace, or the negative peace, there is lack of social demand because people are more interested or more concerned with unemployment or other issues, and are not really interested in learning about conflict resolution or peace building issues. At the same time, I want to say that local NGOs in the region are pretty arrogant when it comes to their approach to what public needs to know about the work that they do, and a lot of times it was mentioned that it's not for the public discussion. The discussions are so sensitive, are so important, that we need to work it in a smaller group. However, while it can be true for a certain period of time, there is no purposeful strategy of engagement with the public to inform them about the work that they do. Within this, I call these relations negatively symmetrical, and unlike in the case of the government, these relationships are symmetrical, negative because there is a lack of trust and lack of interest in each other, that it goes both ways. So there is no interest on the side of the NGOs to engage more public, and the public is not really interested in the work that they do. It would have been easy if we had only these three kind of major players, but things get a little more complicated with the presence of international actors that have a significant impact on the social structure. And this, the second graph kind of represents this changes that happen when we have international actors working alongside local actors and influencing situations. So international organizations become a powerful center of gravity towards which the entire non-governmental sector shifts. Because of their dependency on the funding and the sustainability issues that they have, the local organizations gravitate more towards the source of the funding. They showcase very strong desire to learn the rules of engagement that the international community is mandating, and adapt and learn the rules and the language that is kind of brought down. At the same time, the negative part here is that local NGOs remain relatively powerless. There are very little opportunities for them to impact the agenda, and they are working within a predetermined agenda that is set by the international donor organizations, that is filtering down from the donor country policies. And very rarely that there is a conversation about the local needs and the international policies. This leads to a situation where we have very fragmented and one-sided partnership within between these two actors. It's fragmented because donors, there are no feedback mechanisms or well-functioning feedback mechanisms for for local organizations to engage with the donors, and it's one-sided because it comes down as a way of directive on the side of the international community, and occasional consultations with very selected number of local organizations. This leads to a miscommunication and misunderstanding, a lot of time frustration on the part of the local organizations, just because many of them spoke to me about their frustration and the need to work on these technical issues on the grant proposal and reporting, and spending a lot of time, much more time doing those things than they actually can do in the field. At the same time, donors did not confirm that they are looking for all those technicalities. Actually, donors are not interested in those technical details and want to see a bigger picture, but because of the lack of communication, there is something that is lost in translation, and both of them are actually wasting investing a lot of time and effort in channeling their efforts into something that is not meaningful for the other side. And finally, many of the NGOs spoke to me about this what I call the attention deficit disorder and how it affects their work in the region. Usually, donors often interested funding certain projects only for one funding cycle, which undermines the positions of the NGOs within their communities as they get something started and then they can follow up and deliver on something, and then that kind of affects their standing within their own communities. Within the conversation about international donor communities, I want to particularly zoom in on the issue of international NGOs in this context, with the justification that many international organizations like Oxfam, Care International, Constellation Resources, Safer World, and others have developed to a point that they are equal players with the powerful players as UN agencies or national governments, and have a lot of say and have access to governments and have access to resources that local organizations don't have. At the same time, local organizations in the region were not able to develop to that standards and continue to operate within the shadow of the international NGOs. This dynamics is important because they are assigned very technical and instrumental role within this paradigm, where they are the implementing partners and are implementing a project that was developed for them, not with them, but for them largely by international organizations. And these dynamics are heavily dominated by this global West-South dynamics, where local NGOs have very little agency when it comes to having a say in the structure of the project. This leads also to the fact that international NGOs have sort of monopolized the bilateral peace building and reconciliation space and opened that space up to very selected number of NGOs, and we can see that it shows that the local NGOs become the orbits of larger international organizations, moving further away from their own base, which has the negative impact on the public perception, because a lot of time people see that or think that they are in this work for international travel, for money, for getting access to places and resources, rather than serving the needs of the community. At the same time, locals understood and that there are, given the political dynamics in the region, there are access issues that they cannot overcome, and internationals are able to do the cross-border or bilateral work better just because they have access to places that locals cannot do. At the same time, locals felt that their experience and feeling of the local context and situation will always be unmatched compared to the international organizations who just come in and out of the region. And they appreciate the role of the umbrella that international community is able to provide for their work. However, in this context, the challenge remains for the international NGOs to actually be the person who holds the umbrella rather than drives the entire process forward, giving more agency and more role to the local organizations in the region. Moving to the very last part of the research findings, it's the work and how locals think about reconciliation in the region. It was very surprising to find out that the reconciliation word does not really exist in the vocabulary of the local actors. Conflict resolution and peace building are mostly used, and sometimes NGOs will use confidence building, but I would also argue that the term confidence building is also donor-induced, because there are a lot of mechanisms and funding mechanisms that are developed around that particular verbiage that is introduced to the region without the contextual understanding of what actually reconciliation or confidence building means. And the importance of this language-induced thinking is the way how NGOs conceptualize and think about the work that they do. Unfortunately, the majority of the NGOs thought about their work as operational, which means working within a predetermined framework and that framework is predetermined by their understanding of national identity, their understanding of patriotism, as well as the government approved or allowed limits of engagement. And only very handful of organizations spoke about their role as being structural, that is geared towards changing or creating the new structures that are inclusive and geared towards positive peace. Anything and everything that NGOs did in the region, they deemed worth of peace-building work or conflict resolution work. Human rights trainings, civic education trainings, cultural exhibitions, and analytical work, everything was justified as an activity that supports larger peace. NGOs worked in the inter-community, cross-border formats, but disproportionately high level of intra-community work, working within a single community, within their own communities. And within this intra-community work, I would like to highlight four main approaches that were identified by the local NGOs, with a particular attention to the first one, which is the replicable spaces. This is a very interesting concept that emerged from the research, which talks about working within the creating public forums or spaces or projects within a single community with, that provides reflective, self-critical, self-reflective space for the members of that community to talk about the issues related to the conflict, examining their own faults and their own role within this context, that with the hope that it will inspire the other side to do similar, to embark on similar activities, and maybe at some point those two spaces can merge together for more fundamental transformation and reconciliation. The second, and the important part, the replicability of the space, was non-mandatory. So organizations that spoke about it, they did not expect the other side to do the same. So it was not pushed on the other side, but was a way of a good gesture or a display of a goodwill to have that self-critical examination. The transformation of traditional reconciliation space was something that a lot of NGOs also talked about. And by traditional space, organizations meant that in early 1990s, where conflict just started, a lot of time the cross-border dialogues were the way of working with this within this conflict. But now they are described by stagnation and also inability to conduct those dialogues. And local organizations spoke about the necessity of not building the peace across the conflict divide, but within their own communities. So going back to the working internally within their own public. The two other types applied more to like the day-to-day operations of the organizations, where they spoke about the safe spaces and ability to provide safety for the conversations to happen. And it was interesting to find out that the concept of safety was very multidimensional. It meant also what language will be used at the meeting, where the meeting will take place, how the participants will get there, and it also did not mean only for the cross-border project, but also for the local project as well. How this holistic safety of the space where self-critical conversation and meaningful conversation can take place. And finally, positive spaces, which is an approach. The conflicts in the region have over 25 years of history, and throughout this time there are many negative stereotypes and many negative stories that are being shared about the other side or about the enemy. And this was a purposeful attempt on the side of the local organization to create spaces that exclusively emphasize positive experiences with the other side, and are nurturing this positive context that can provide an alternative to the dominant negative narratives that exist in the region. An important aspect of how the spaces are being created is actually the selection of participants and how people are entering the spaces and how they get selected to be part of this peace building and reconciliation spaces. Open calls, system of references and recommendation, and closed groups are the three most frequently used approaches. However, I have to say that the open calls are very rarely used in the region. A lot of times NGOs choose system of recommendation and referrals, as well as working with already predetermined group of people that they feel comfortable and confident working with. The importance and the tremendous significance of this practices is the effect that that these practices have on the peace building, perception of peace building and reconciliation in general. The genuine desire of local organizations to safeguard the fragile spaces within their own communities actually backfire in a way by portraying them as exclusive and only for selected individuals, which creates a negative predisposition by the local communities. So, to conclude quickly, there has been a major shift in the region from bilateral reconciliation work to working internally, and part of that shift is the process of adaptation to the government pressure and inability to do the cross-border work. At the same time, it is also adaptation to the fact that a bilateral reconciliation space is being taken up exclusively by international organizations. Peace building and reconciliation work is being largely done in isolation from each other, with the hope that at some point it can merge into something bigger. At the same time, reconciliation spaces remain exclusive and largely closed for the public, which the positive thing of this internal work is also that unilateral work is still possible given the restrictive environment, political environment that the region is facing today. But at the same time, the closed and exclusive spaces that these organizations create undermine the credibility of reconciliation work in general in the region. So what we can do about it and how we can move this paradigm further and make some positive change. I believe for the scholar practitioners, if we, with our engagement, if we try to institutionalize and systematize the professional development and learning opportunities for local organizations throughout engagement and help them to conceptualize and learn practices of inclusive peace and reconciliation, and not work on only instrumental conflict management that looks at the development of peaceful societies in isolation, this can help to promote more positive peace in the region. For the donor organizations, I truly believe that there should be a shift from the concept of implementing partners to development partners, where the local organizations will be assigned more agency and more role in their work. And also donors have to be able to create a feedback mechanism and direct channels of communication that can help to bridge their policy interests with the local needs. I'm hoping that donors can look at this and reevaluate their current selective strategies and how their own practices are actually eroding the foundations of local NGOs rather than helping to create a coherent and sustainable NGO sector. And finally, for the local peace building and reconciliation NGOs, there should be an understanding of and the necessary shift from a negative competition to more constructive engagement with each other. The consideration of how to open up the space and change the selective practices to make it safe, but at the same time inclusive for other larger voices and people in their own communities, it can be very important. And most importantly, local NGOs should develop more purposeful public forums where the myths and conspiracies about their work can be diffused, and also public can get up-to-date and detailed information about the work they do, what are potential dangers, but also what are the benefits for the community. And I hope that this can help and foster more public engagement in their work. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was a very comprehensive overview of some detailed work you've done over the last several years. Thank you for that summary synthesis. We will turn now to the committee members for questions first. And then we'll turn to the rest of you all here for questions too, so be ready. Allison is our esteemed outside committee member. Thank you for volunteering your time here.
Inside outsider.
From, yeah.
This was fabulous because first, a lot from a personal perspective, having worked with NGOs and international and local in Bosnia, and flipping like an NGO that we worked with into a local non-governmental organization, but also the fact that you went and you connected the international donors and international organizations, NGOs, into this whole discussion, because it's not just one piece. We can't look at it that way. So it was like a lot of different things coming together, and reading it was really very interesting. One of the things that struck me, even at the beginning, was how you had the discussion about, you know, political settlement comes at the political elite level, and then they just leave all of the peace building stuff, you know, to the local NGOs, let them take care of it, type of a thing. That really struck me, having not been in this literature for a while, and especially in the reconciliation literature in a while too, because the idea of it not being this linear process and how you explain how it isn't really like that, it's more dynamic. I thought well done. The lit review was really very good. You picked on all the different pieces. Really liked how you used the triangle letter X to go and say, no, actually those NGOs should be up a little higher, you know, and then how the findings made you believe that they should be into the middle, but also outside, and then gravitating around the international non-governmental organizations. I thought that was really bright as well. You said something, though, that really struck me in your presentation on that, which was why it made me think how you have the circles that are inside that one section and even around. You made the comment that they're not cohesive, they're not like one, and if they were, how could they help the region as a whole? So my question about that is, why would we assume that they should be?
Should be one?
Yeah, one community. I mean, because here in the United States, for sure, in other conflict zones, you know, it's very clear that, you know, the NGO community is siloed. Even with the United Nations, they go and they have folks, even those, the UN agencies, as leads, you know, with whatever functional area. So why would we assume that here in the Caucasus it should be more cohesive?
So I think the comment there, I referred to the fact that they always developed as separate bubbles rather than being, and because the concept of NGOs or non-governmental organizations is pretty new to this newly independent state, they were not able, by not cooperating with each other enough, they were not able to develop the sense of field in general that would be viewed as such by the public, that would have trust in not a single organization. Because the interesting comment that came from the NGOs themselves is that individually, person so-and-so has deep trust and is respected by the community, but his or her work as an NGO person is completely not respected or even questioned by the same public. So I think what I meant is that by coming together as a sector and developing a structure as an NGO sector, they will be able to communicate more and be more authoritative, both with the respected by the public and also taken into account more by the government. It's not going to be, oh, the government will shut down this organization. They have to work with a larger, a stronger structure, basically.
So that's why in the dissertation at one point you had a comment about how if one organization was, you know, criticizing, how others would come and support them. Okay, now I understand that better. That's the other thing that was very interesting about your dissertation, this difference between like this is an NGO, it's an organization, allegedly, but really it sounds like it's just one person, you know, in the suitcase NGO, you know, so that was fascinating to me too. I want you to relook how you talk about your unit of analysis in the methodology section, because I think there's a little bit of that, the language, just look at it again, because it goes organization, 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 individual. I think it just needs to be language-wise, just massaged to be a little bit more cohesive. Nothing big, but just check it out. Time was really confusing to me in the dissertation. Also space and actors, because I never had the sense of, I know how many people you interviewed. I was thinking maybe it's because of being careful and sensitive to NGOs in the region, and so that's why it was never laid out, hey, we had 45, there were 40 NGOs, and 3 were located here, there, and the other place. Okay. I didn't understand. I never really understood too, like, well, how many actual NGOs were actually there, or even international non-governmental organizations. And again, that might have been a choice that you made, and I didn't know, but it kind of left me hanging because I didn't have a point of reference to say, well, this is really only a small amount of groups who are a little bit upset because they can't get funding, you know, or is this more? And also, at the beginning of the dissertation, you are several times, and I came across, like the whole impression I had was they were just focusing internally with their own local communities. It wasn't about the bilats or dialogues. And then later on, it was as if there was a dramatic shift. And I didn't even know what time we were talking about here, because it wasn't until I saw your presentation that you did the collection in 2015. And so that would mean that people would have done their programming through, let's say, 13 or something like that. So that would have helped me out a little bit too as a reader, only to know like what time frame that we're talking about and stuff. But that other piece about the internal versus it was really bilateral was more the preference. I think just I need a little bit more help with the time in the dissertation. But again, Susan is in charge, and whatever Susan says, you will do.
And we are grateful for outside eyes that are able to say, wait a minute, when was the time frame?
This is really great. Yeah. Actors too, just the same thing. I was stunned by your conclusion. The last chapter, I was like, okay, going along, you know, and in each of the chapters, I guess I'm a little bit more detail oriented. So I was kind of like looking for bookends because there was so much great meat that was in the center. I was like, I got to the end of a chapter and it would be like, okay, you were at a very high level in discussing some things, but I'm like, ah, man, maybe she's missing some stuff because there were some really hard-hitting facts that were like listed there, which were in the end, which was great. But I guess I was looking for some bookending, but not to have her do that if she can graduate right away. But when I got to the last chapter, I was like blown away because you really called it. You know, a lot of us who work in this field notice that there are the same people showing up time and time again. You know, and when I was in one of the prior chapters, you were explaining about the safety and the safety of the spaces, safety of the people, that sort of thing. And I was like, okay, so maybe me as an outsider, I didn't really know that as much, which is totally fine. But the exclusive nature of it and the lack of inclusivity, you really, really highlighted why in the conclusion. I think that that was really good to call it what it is. And even in your recommendations here, how you're talking about trying to help that community if they want it, which I don't even think that, I mean, you refer to them as being elitist, and I think that's very true. They may not even want that help because they don't perceive that they need it. I thought that was very interesting as well. The whole piece about the implementing partners, this is my last thing because just thinking about different things. This was the one thing that was striking me. I was reading it because there seemed to be my sense that they were upset because yes, we have more contact and might have more power, maybe because we're working through these NGOs, the international ones, to touch upon the donors, but oh, woe is me, we can't, they're not listening, that sort of thing. From the donor perspective, I think what is interesting is I think that they created, maybe it's like 10 years ago, this, not a requirement, but international NGOs here, let's say even in US, you have to have a local implementer in order to move forward with the proposal. The understanding is that you have already got those relationships, or you're working with them to already pre-do this talking about what a proposal will look like and stuff. I think what your research is showing is that's not really happening, at least in the South Caucasus, right? Because they're not feeling as if their ideas are being placed within these proposals. Yeah. And we have heard this criticism too, that the international NGOs just, hey Mara, will you work there? Okay, let me write your name down type of thing. Susan, you too. So, there's a little, it's not deceit, but playing around at that level as well. And I think that your dissertation is demonstrating that, but you might not have said that. Okay. So I think that it was very interesting. Fabulous work. I loved reading it.
Thank you.
I don't get to read anymore, so this was really great. Thank you very much. My one other comment I told you before was, for readers, it would be really helpful to have more of an organizational structure with your headers. Just adding in Roman numerals, ABC, 1, 2, 3, 4, that sort of thing would have helped me a lot too, because I kind of started getting lost. Okay. Yeah. But thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Very helpful feedback. Appreciate it. Mara, let's turn to you.
So I'm trying to figure out how much, where do I have questions, and where do I have comments, and where do I have conversations? So it's not all possible to do these here. And partially that's because, not the confusion of which I'm going to do, but that this is really rich. And to have something that is both practice-oriented and looking at what's actually happening and how can we understand the dynamics of where the work is being done and where it's not being done. And one of the statements that you had made is that the idea of language-induced thinking can't be underestimated, since the way local NGOs name the work they do largely defines their own perception of their roles within their respective societies. And so I think that that's a really powerful statement of why the interpretive approach works, and why going to NGOs and to representatives, and unfortunately fewer of the donor folks, actually is really important research, and that it says how people think of the possibilities influences the possibilities that exist and where they can go. So I think that conceptualization part is a really important part, and you constructed a piece of research that went to and made use of what they could tell you. So you were asking questions of them and investigating something that they could help you understand. So that's a nice match up there. And just the idea of who does reconciliation work, what does reconciliation work mean, and the power of paying attention to context. I think you've made a really good argument for and outlining of this is why context matters, and this is how it has influenced, and this is how it appears in this particular place, in this particular time. That part is just so much fun to read, and I very much enjoyed the tour through that and the construction. Because you said that how we think about things matter, and because you're looking at context and positionality, one of the things I was trying to figure out is the balance between abstract thinking and concepts and sort of the facts on the ground, the things that you were actually discovering. And I think you made really good use, as you noted, of letter X triangle to sort of ground a way to how do we depict these relationships, how do we think about these concepts. So I wanted to ask you a question, because there are some terms that float around that I think are very important in this, because at different points you're dealing with political elites at the top and then the center section and then these people out here, the international community, and you're dealing with grassroots. But then there's also terms floating around of doing social work as opposed to political work. And you also talk about civil society and non-government organizations, and that they're not entirely the same thing and they're separate. So I wonder if you could say a little bit more of your thinking and how that developed as you were working through this research of the intersection of political decision-making and social fabric and reconciliation, and NGOs and civil society. If you could just say a little bit more about how you're thinking about that developed, and then I've got a follow-on question.
So I prefer for this research, I prefer to think about civil society as like the umbrella term, as a larger, a bigger sector where you have NGOs, you have charitable organizations, you have other entities, you have media, because how they are the roles that they play and then the influence that they have on the shaping and the developing certain type of public opinion. The difficulty, as you also kind of identified, was to making a clear separation between the political roles and the social roles of NGOs, especially when those that are dealing with the conflict issues. Because of the political nature of the conflict, a lot of NGOs chose the political path, like working in analytical work, doing providing recommendations, doing research, public opinion polls, and trying to figure out certain how they can influence the political agenda. But other organizations chose to do more like providing services to the youth, disadvantaged youth in the conflict-affected areas, or doing educational projects. So there is, within those two categories, there is not really that clean of a distinction between how they reconcile their political roles with the kind of their social interaction. But what was clear to me, at least how they spoke about their role, that their desire to be up there with the government, and this is how they kind of tried not to be political, but to be the supporting pillar of the political work in that sense, and being able to influence the government's decision or any type of policy decision that has impact in the conflict areas for their society.
Okay. And so when you were doing your interviews and identifying organizations, would you say that the organizations that were self-identified and identified by you as doing peace and conflict and reconciliation work, does that include the ones that you just talked about, like doing analytical work or policy recommendations or youth-based work? So
one of the organizations, for example, was doing, I almost said the name of the organization. One of the organizations was doing the civil monitoring of armed forces. And they considered that to be a big part of their peace-building agenda. Doing the monitoring of the contact line, and also investigating into non-combat related death in the army. So that was very political work, but at the same time, in their mind, that a critically important work that they're doing to support the peace building in the region and within the country. So, but at the same time, which goes again into the donor-induced or donor-run processes, is many organizations do all of them at the same time. It depends what is the grant announcement is for, and a lot of times organizations don't pick and choose, and there have been very honest quotes that we learn about this opportunity and we adjust our priorities based on that. Very few organizations said, no, we have a set strategy, a set vision, and we attract funding based on our interests rather than go with the flow.
Mm-hmm. No, and that would reflect sort of a sense of how things happen pretty much everywhere in the donor NGO world. So I find that sort of just that quick thumbnail really helpful of the type of work. I know that there's a sensitivity with not wanting to identify organizations, and how do you say what people do without then being able to pinpoint what organizations do. I think something in there would have helped me. It had felt like, as it came down, that the definition of what these organizations were doing were the ones who were doing cross-border work, who then increasingly turned internal. And that cross-border work then in my head turns primarily into, oh, we bring people together and it's a dialogue or it's negotiations of some sort, as opposed to that kind of nuance of where are we doing political work, where are we doing influence of social opinion, where are we shaping attitudes. So I think there's an interpenetration across the different levels that the political elite aren't the only ones who are doing politics per se, and the grassroots aren't just being acted upon by everybody else to a certain extent. And so there's something in naming what it is that NGOs are doing that I think is part of that conversation of what do we mean by civil society? What do we mean by what is the function of political elites? Are they is it just governance, or is it because they have decision-making powers? Is it what makes them elite? What makes them at the top of the triangle? And so I think there's some conceptual clarity in saying what this model is actually talking about that then translates also into how you talk about these organizations and how to walk that tightrope between not giving too much information about the specifics of what they do, but that there's a nuance there and entrepreneurialness and adaptability that I think helps explain that concept of the space that they're maintaining and really how diverse that space really is, the work that they're doing. I don't know if that tour made sense. Do you want to ask me any questions about what I just said?
No, I think I got it, and she was going to take.
That makes good sense.
Does that make sense? Okay. Let's see. Because I think that what that also helps clarify is, and maybe I missed this or I didn't note it, and I know that I've asked you before that the focus on NGOs, we don't talk about NGOs in the United States. We talk about a nonprofit sector. Because it's a non-governmental, but there's a presumption domestically that there's something that exists between just unconnected peoples and the governance structure. And you had just now mentioned, you talked about churches and media and some other piece. And so I wonder how much that turn to local and intra work also then reflects a development of a domestic, of that layer of nonprofits as opposed to non-governmental organizations that are a creature of the international donor community.
Honestly, I still, the major shift that is happening now, or at least there is, they are trying linguistically to make that shift, is non-governmental, like that term, is being interpreted a lot of times as anti-governmental. Mm-hmm. So there is a desire to make that shift of to an alternative language that would take that stigma away of being anti-governmental and ease a lot of pressure. But I think still, again, I don't want to speculate, but based on the data that I have gathered, I would still say that the shift towards working internally is still a result that there are very limited space for them to work in a cross-border, and the preference, not that it would be a preference, the preference would be probably do the both, cross-border as well as intra-community, but the dominance of single community work is their way of adapting to inability to do the cross-border work. A lot of organizations spoke about that they had the money, the funding to do the cross-border work, and they either had to return the money because it was not possible, or had to shift their focus and apply for like reprogramming of their activities to be able to do the work internally. So I would still say that it's more a strategy of adaptation rather than a different shift in the society.
Okay. Okay. So, and then just to shift a follow-up question, separate question on the research and the methodology. What did you feel like doing that
what was doing the interviews like? What did you feel like you learned from doing the interviews that you were surprised by or you wouldn't have done otherwise?
I was very, very surprised with the lack of interest, honestly, and given a lot of even the NGOs that knew me personally in Armenia from my previous work at the embassy, and I had a respect. Even those organizations were very difficult to contact, and I had many that refused and didn't participate. So that was the fascinating thing for me, that I always assumed, and especially in my ethical consideration part, that as I was embarking on it, I thought I would have a challenge. Oh, they want to talk to me because I'm connected to an outside organization and I can be potentially funding generating mechanisms. No, it was zero interest in that. And I think I was fascinated by some very honest, like brutally honest answers and self-reflection that NGOs had. But I also was impressed. Some of the interviews that I did were with the organization that I previous working experience and a continuous experience after the interviews, and how they have the things that they told me as part of interview were, some of them were confirmed later on, but some additional information surfaced in a private conversation that I did not honestly know how to include in the research, because I didn't know what, because it was not part of that specific interview, and I didn't know how to reconcile it with what they told me in an interview and what is my experience working with them. So that was really interesting, that still they wanted to show that their work is really important, like really important.
So and I think that sense of your sense of what you learned and what you couldn't learn and some of the challenges, I would recommend that you might want to expand a little bit in the methodology section of what can you learn from interviews, what can't you, what are some of the challenges, and especially with the emphasis and connecting it to the conceptualization, how people understand and how they talk about that. But then it makes some challenges for the researcher of, do you just take everything as the truth, or how do you work with that information, and what can we learn, and mostly what can we learn, but then what are some of the disadvantages? So you might want to have, because the way you just said that was lovely, and that highlighted sort of in a nutshell what are all the things that we know research and data-wise, the challenges that interviewing present. So I would just recommending expanding that a little bit, not a ton, but just to note that since you know it and experienced it, it has a place. I think there's also something to perhaps revisit in the methodology around, you use the idea of generalizability and also replicability as well as validity. And I think there's some, actually I don't think, I know there are arguments that are out there of, do we reclaim those terms for people who are doing qualitative research? Do we use and reinterpret and reclaim the positivist terms, the traditional terms that are our quality criteria terms, that are what we measure good research against? Or do we use new terminology because qualitative research gives us something different? So I would argue that, and I know that you've used Yin's definition of generalizability, why can we generalize from within case studies? And I thought you did that argument well. I think there's some question is whether or not replicability is the correct word for that, because I think replicability is so tied to experimental designs and the repetition of treatments in some way that I think it doesn't really feel like that fits here, but a couple places you had used that term. I think there are better ways to say doing interpretive work, doing qualitative work has criteria against which we can measure it. And that on those standards, you don't have to kind of pretend to measure up to standards that somebody invented for a different form of research. So I would consider using some of that language in the methodology chapter, because I think that then that speaks to also, why should we go to the people who are living this and ask them about their experiences?
as opposed to running, gold standard experimental designs that evaluate the work that's being done. Because I think you did something different that helps us understand how is the work being done and why isn't it always working, and what do people know that they're not allowed to say, and they're just continuing to live within a system that isn't working for them. So I think that would help parallel both methodology and then what your findings actually showed us, which is that there are some real gaps there and some real functional reasons why those gaps exist.
Thank you.
Thank you. Very, very helpful. Well, you picked a good committee, Margarita. Really helpful.
Oh, and the other thing, and I have some text based comments, but we can talk about how we make those available.
Awesome. Thank you. So I would like to ask you about something that didn't work so well in your methodology, which was getting donors to talk to you. Mm-hmm. What did you learn from that? How do you make sense of that? Like, that too is data of a sort.
Yeah, that was fascinating. It's not only ignoring, but very open. We're not going to participate. We cannot talk about our engagement policies or approaches, and that was fascinating. Mm-hmm. I did not. The recurring pattern made me think if they don't want to disclose any information about fundability or funding criteria, not to make it publicly available information. Mm-hmm. I don't know, again, I don't have any feedback why. It was not explained why, it was just said no. Mm-hmm. So I'm again assuming that it was a way of safeguarding their fundability criterias and still having the ones who will be making the decisions on the funding and make it, I guess, equally accessible to
mm-hmm.
everyone.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure, honestly, but it was very interesting because I thought, they would be very interested. And this goes to both government mm-hmm. donors and also private organizations mm-hmm. that are non-government affiliated.
Very interesting.
Yeah.
So you all have been very patient. Let's turn to our audience here. Anyone want to ask a question? No?
I didn't have a question, but more of a comment.
Okay.
As somebody who knows, I'm a friend of Margarita's. I teach pre-K through 8th grade French, so I have no background knowledge on this whatsoever. So coming into this and really getting a comprehensive idea of what this is all about and how this works, and I felt very like I was getting the full lowdown, and it was made very accessible to me. But I particularly appreciated the triangulation, that graph, and where it stands, and then kind of Margarita's version of that, and how that sort of, I saw that of where she sees it existing and how it exists, and then I appreciated how all these and the international donors and like, where's the money coming from? And then these guys pop off and they circle around the money, and then how is that reconciled? And then the public, and I think I just felt very, she did a great job with connecting the recommendations with how to reconcile that with the issues, and just in a space where the public can really get the benefits of these people who are working in the non-NGOs, and all of their efforts sincere? Are they, and how do they reach the public when the public is so influenced by the government? And so I kind of just saw all those dynamics and things that she's told me, but then this made it really comprehensive for me, and I appreciated that, and I saw that kind of the visual of the public coming up, kind of that sector coming up closer to the NGOs for me was made clear through her recommendations. Anyway.
Great. Well, thank you, and I'm glad you were able to join us today. Great. Any other questions? No? Okay.
Okay. So. Thank you for it's so nice to finally be here today and support you after seeing how all of this after seeing all the pieces and then seeing it all come together. So thank you for that great presentation and the knowledge. I just wanted to ask, based on what you know now and the behaviors of all the different pieces of donors and stuff, do you think it's possible that we can see some changed behaviors in this whole equation?
I truly believe we can, because and because of the constraint of the time, I could not include like all the rich details in the presentation, but there are some seeds that I think needs more nurturing. For example, in one of the communities in Abkhazia, local NGOs have this, what I want to call the adopt the NGO approach, which when they apply for funding, they reach out to the remote areas and find an NGO in a remote area and like push them to apply together. So it's a great resource and a great practice that can be kind of nurtured further to make the sector more coherent and can induce a better behavior and more inclusive practices. So I do believe that because of the heavy engagement of outside actors in the region, I think there are some things that we can bring with us too that can further translate, because we taught, or the international community taught, the local organizations to do conflict resolution. We can help them further their practices in more inclusive and participatory ways, I think.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. I think the committee will now go have a brief committee meeting.
Thank you.
And we will come back and talk with you soon.
Thank you.
So, thank you.